Well, thanks, Brother Nathan, and welcome everyone to our lecture this evening. So tonight we're going to have a bit of a detailed look at the Greek king Alexander the Great, or as his Greek friends call him, Megas Alexandros. And for those of you who aren't Greek, that's apparently how you say Alexander the Great in Greek. It's Megas Alexandros. To start our lecture off this evening, we're going to spend a bit of time looking at Alexander the Great himself from a purely historical perspective. However, as the majority of our lectures here are based on or have some sort of inherent connection to the Bible, after that we're going to have a look at Alexander the Great in correlation with the Bible and hopefully make it clear to you all why we care about Alexander at all and why we've chosen to spend an entire night looking at him. So like we said, we're going to start off looking at a bit of history, and there's a lot of information about Alexander the Great, and that's perhaps because he's considered one of the even today, one of the greatest military minds ever to have lived because of what he accomplished and to what lengths he went to achieve his conquests. So Alexander the Great was born in Pella in Macedonia, which is, actually I'll point to it, it's just up here, in 356 BC. His mother was Queen Olympias and his father was Philip II of Macedon, who was the current ruler of Macedonia at the time. And it was primarily responsible for making Macedonia the force that it was when Alexander eventually took control. At the age of 13, Alexander was educated by a Greek philosopher by the name of Aristotle at the temple of the Nymphs at Myatsa. Aristotle's method of teaching was quite holistic and didn't necessarily confine Alexander to the classroom, but rather tried to cultivate Alexander's intellect as well as his character. He took advantage of the natural surroundings of the Temple of the Nymphs and took Alexander on walks through the gardens and engaged him in discussions about the natural world that they were surrounded by. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that his method of teaching was purely abstract, but it was primarily based on observation and experience, which in turn encouraged Alexander to think critically and to work things out for himself. Now, the method used by Aristotle was referred to in his writings in De Anima, where he says, "Whenever one contemplates, one necessarily at the same time contemplates in images." Basically saying people don't always learn from being told, but also by being shown and by experiencing of themselves, which is the journey that he took Alexander on. All of this promoted in Alexander a sort of sense of curiosity and a sense of wonder, qualities that, as we'll see, served him well later in his conquests. By the age of 18, he was heavily involved, not Aristotle, Alexander was heavily involved in the Macedonian military campaigns, even joining his father at the Battle of Coronea in Boeotia at 338 BC, and he even led his own small army at that time. This battle was essentially involved an overthrowing of Athens and Thebes, which meant essentially the end of Greek independence in the area, as well as creating a doorway to the rest of Europe and the Middle East for the Macedonians. The victory was accredited to Alexander as he was placed as a leader of the Macedonian front at a very key point of the battle, which ultimately led to the Macedonians' overall success of that particular battle. Once Alexander's father died in 336 BC, Alexander the Great took control of the Macedonian Empire and continued his father's attempts to take over the Persian Empire, which was west of the Macedonian region, which had been his father's ultimate goal. So Alexander's immediate action was to take over Thrace, which started with the burning of the city of Thebes, because of the continuing revolutions against Alexander, which he saw as an immediate threat to his goal of taking over the Persian Empire. And as you can see, Thrace was a very important region for Alexander to take to be able to access the rest of the Persian Empire to the east, as it was the closest point for direct access to the area of Persia. Now, after Alexander had taken control of the Greek continent, the entire Greek continent, which also included the taking of Thessaly, he and his army crossed the channel from Greece to Persia, which is modern-day Turkey, in 334 BC to fight what's called the Battle of Granicus against the Persian army at the Granicus River, which is also northwest Turkey. This was essentially the first major battle led solely by Alexander to be able to, at the age of 22, he was successful in this battle, and it enabled him to set himself and his army up in his enemy territory, or Persian territory. Now, a notable event that took place not long after that battle was in 333 BC, when Alexander was challenged to untie the Gordian knot in Gordium, which is also northwest Turkey. So that knot, the Gordian knot, was a knot that was tied by Gordius, who was a king of Phrygia in Persia, and legend said that if you managed to untie it, you were destined to be the ruler of Asia and of the whole world. And he was challenged to untie the knot because people wanted to see if he was destined to rule Asia, and due to his previous military success, and also he wanted to prove that he could do it. Now, rather than bothering to untie it, Alexander just used his sword to cut right through it. And some say this demonstrated his mental genius by using a new form of doing things that wasn't expected, which, in the sense of his military techniques in the future, it was demonstrated by his brute force and his cunning. Now, the situation with the Gordian knot was actually referred to by Shakespeare in Henry V, where he wrote, "Turn him to any cause of policy, the Gordian knot of hit will he unloose, familiar as his garter." Basically, it was like second nature to him to complete this challenge. Just as easy as it was for him to loosen his garter, he cut through the knot like it was something he did every day. And this, according to writers at the time, was how he acted during battle. It felt as if he was born for this, or it was just second nature to move from obstacle to obstacle and just get rid of it without any sort of issue, as familiar as his garter, as familiar to loose as his garter. And just as another aside, I wanted to quickly show an example of Alexander's military tactics and show why him and his army were so effective in battle. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the tactics of the Macedonian army, probably only those of you who've played Age of Empires, but the Macedonian phalanx, as you can see on the screen, was a key tactic that Alexander used in his campaigns, both offensively and defensively. And it's still regarded today as one of the greatest and most undefeatable military strategies. So the overall tactic, it's called the hammer and the anvil, was referred to as the bread and butter of many of Alexander's greatest military successes, and it was made up of two parts. So the anvil consisted of this Macedonian phalanx, which was the crucial defensive arm of Alexander's army. I've just made a small graphic here. So Alexander would send his light skirmishers to occupy the opposing infantry and then hold them in place by sending the phalanx, which was possible because of the sheer length of their sarissæ, or the long swords that they held. And as the phalanx held the enemy in position, Alexander would lead his Macedonian cavalry, his hetairai, against a weak part of the enemy line. And then, having landed a critical blow against their opponents, Alexander and his hetairai would then move round behind the enemy infantry, who were already engaged with the phalanx, and then deal a death or a hammer blow from behind. And then this acted as the hammer that delivered the fatal blow, while the phalanx acted as the anvil, sandwiching the enemy infantry. So this maneuver was used extensively by Alexander, and it was strong against nations which tended to rely on cavalry in their front line, as the spearmen and the skirmishers, or Alexander's spearmen and skirmishers, could stand behind the phalanx and still attack using ranged weapons. And this was just one of the tactics that Alexander used, among many, but it was one of the most effective and commonly used as part of the campaign, and it was the reason for much of his success. Back to the story though. As we know, Alexander had just arrived in Persian territory in the northwest, and after winning the Battle of Granicus and cutting the Gordian knot, he quickly moved south towards southern Anatolia, which is sort of current-day southeast Turkey-ish, and in 333 BC began the Battle of Issus against Darius III, who was king of Persia, which is roughly in this area. No, it's not actually Cilicia, but it's in that sort of area. Again, he won this battle, but Darius fled and he wasn't killed at that time. However, that then meant that Alexander's territory had now expanded all the way to the top of the Middle Eastern area, from Greece and Macedonia, as you can see there. His next action was to move slowly south to take Syria and Phoenicia, which would be the final piece of the puzzle in removing the Persians' access to any of their coastal ports on the mainland. As part of taking over this particular area, it included Alexander's 7-month siege of the new city of Tyre, which started in 332 BC, which was considered one of Alexander's greatest military achievements. Now, just as a small aside to this, I thought it would be useful to demonstrate the lengths Alexander went to achieve his military goals, showing that literally nothing was safe when he wanted to attack. So we're just going to have a look at the siege of Tyre now. So, after he's defeated Darius III, he headed into Phoenicia, where Persian envoys met with Alexander to ask what he wanted and why he was there. Alexander's only request of those people was that he wanted to sacrifice to Heracles, which was a Greek god, in Tyre, in the new Tyre. Now, as Tyre was the most defended city that they had, and was seen as their base, the Tyrians and the Phoenicians assumed, correctly, that this was an attempt to take over the city, and they refused, telling him that he was welcome to use Old Tyre instead, which was on the mainland of Phoenicia. However, in Alexander's mind, Old Tyre had no strategic advantage whatsoever. And this refusal of him to worship in the new Tyre was essentially a declaration of war. However, the Tyrians weren't overly worried because they had a powerful navy, they had a powerful army. Their city was about 800 metres offshore on an island, and it had 46-metre high walls, and there was no way of getting there on foot. The reason it was so important for Alexander to take Tyre before proceeding further south was because Alexander wanted to ensure that he was not attacked from the rear by the Persian army while attacking Egypt, because Tyre was regarded as the stronghold of the Persian fleet. Before commencing his siege, Alexander sent a demand to Tyre to surrender, but the Tyrians executed the Macedonian envoys he'd sent and threw them over the walls into the sea. This prompted Alexander to commence his operation, or his siege, or his attack, in 332 BC. So he settled in Old Tyre on the mainland and started constructing a causeway, or what they call a mole, across the channel towards Tyre. He did this by deconstructing Old Tyre. He used rocks, he used timber, and he used rubble, and basically anything that he could find to make a path across the water to the city. And as they got closer, they began to receive attacks from Tyre, which slowed their progress. So Alexander's response was to construct 2 siege towers at the end of the causeway with artillery on top to return fire at the city. So the Tyrians then filled an old transport ship with some flammable material and lit it on fire, and they sent it across to the siege towers, and it burnt them to the ground. Alexander's response was just to widen the causeway and add more siege towers to enable more firepower to be sent back at the Tyrians and any ships they might be tempted to send again. He also recognised that the key to winning this battle was naval superiority. So he brought ships from Sidon, and he also was given 120 ships from other allies, which meant that he had 220 ships in his fleet. So Alexander sailed all of his ships toward Tyre. He didn't attack, he just stopped and showed off to the Tyrians that they were obviously vastly outnumbered, to which the Tyrians' immediate response was not to resign, but to begin blockading the entrances to both of their harbours, the north and the south. They did this by floating a boom across their southern Egyptian harbour and mooring 3 triremes, or 3 ships, side by side in front of the northern harbour in Sidon. Alexander's response was to ram the ships in the northern harbour and sink them, but he didn't attack. Instead, he moored some ships in front of the northern harbour with siege engines mounted on board, as well as on the causeway he'd previously constructed, and started a constant bombardment of the city. The Tyrians had also put huge rocks in the sea just below the walls, so Alexander was unable to get his ships too close to the city. So some of Alexander's ships dropped ropes and started trying to tow these rocks away from the walls, to which the Tyrians' response was to send out armour-clad ships to try and cut the ropes trailing behind those ships to keep the rocks in place. So Alexander's response was to make some of his own armoured ships and start pushing the Tyrian ships away. But the Tyrians' response was to send divers down and start cutting the ropes of the ship so they couldn't keep pulling the rocks away. So Alexander's response was to replace the ropes with chains, and eventually they succeeded in moving the rocks away from the base of the city. And the entire time this was happening, all of the ships, Alexander's and the Tyrians, were engaging in a long and hard artillery duel, with the Tyrians pouring cauldrons of red-hot sand over the walls onto the ships, which obviously when caught in the wind, they caught the ships and the men on fire. The Tyrians had also prepared a surprise attack by hanging sails over their North Sidonian harbour and secretly rowing out past the sails in a single line, catching some of Alexander's ships by surprise, sinking some and scattering others. So Alexander himself, in response to this, boarded a ship personally led the counterattack and sunk all of those Tyrian ships, after which he commanded a direct attack to the walls on the south of the city by moving ships against the walls and pounding them with battering rams. An attack was also commenced at the northern end, wasn't successful. At the same time in the south there was a small breach made in the wall, but that was also not successful. So after 3 days of waiting, Alexander ordered multiple attacks as a diversion all around the city, while he led an attack toward the south, which resulted in the Macedonians finally forcing their way onto the walls using bridging equipment dropped off on the south beach. Eventually, more sides of the city were breached, including the harbours, and Alexander and his army took over the city. And that marked the end of a 7-month siege, starting in January and ending in July. And Alexander finally made his sacrifice to Heracles and could now focus on moving further south toward Egypt. So that's a very, very brief story of him taking Tyre. Very eventful and a very interesting story, and I hope I managed to demonstrate to you that Alexander never ever gave up on achieving what he needed to achieve. If an issue came up, he'd have a solution and he'd eventually get what he wanted. So now let's continue with the campaign. He continued south to take Egypt in 332 BC, later in that year, and he received the double crown, meaning he ruled both Upper and Lower Egypt. So the double crown is made up of 2 crowns, the Deshret, which is Upper Egypt, and the Hedjet, which is Lower Egypt, and when combined, they represent unified Egypt. So Alexander had both of these crowns, meaning that he conquered both Upper and Lower Egypt. He then founded Alexandria in 331 BC, which you'll sort of see later informs his naming scheme across his entire campaign, as he also decides to name a lot more cities Alexandria because he loved Alexandria in Egypt so much. Also in 331 BC, he continued northeast, and in Gaugamela in 331 BC, he defeated Darius III's army again in a skirmish called the Battle of Arbela. However, just like last time in 333 BC, Darius fled and he wasn't killed. Alexander then overtook the province of Babylon, which involved the burning of the palace of Xerxes in Persepolis, and a little bit southeast, which was a little bit southeast of Gaugamela in 330 BC. He then continued east, and he started taking control of an area which stretched the entire length of the Oxus and the Jaxartes rivers. And for reference, the Oxus is now known as the Amu Darya, and the Jaxartes is the Sur Darya. At this point, I think it's fairly useful to put up a map of the entire campaign so you can sort of see where we're at, which is in the top right over there, near Sogdiana. And like we said, he founded cities as we went, most of them called Alexandria, to ensure he kept control of the area that he defeated. So he conquered the northern area of that Eastern Asian section, and which would today be called Tajikistan, just for reference. And as part of Alexander taking control of this area, he also married a princess called Roxana, who was the daughter of Oxyartes, who was in control of that area. Oxyartes was apparently involved in the murder of Darius, the same Darius in control of the 2 armies that Alexander had previously defeated. Alexander's cohort, or his army, was initially against the marrying of Roxana, but it became clear that this also helped the Sogdians, or people who lived in Sogdiana, become less opposed to Alexander, and they sided with him in his occupation of that area. So Alexander later appointed Oxyades, the father of Roxana, to be the governor of one of the regions that he later took in India later on. So in 326 BC, he reached the Hyphasis River in eastern India, as you can see just on the right there, like right at the edge. And it was at this point that after the many years of battling and moving quickly eastward, that Alexander's men mutinied and decided that they didn't want to continue into Indian territory on Alexander's consistently dangerous missions. The historian Arrian speaks about this when he says, "The country beyond the Hyphasis was said to be prosperous and its inhabitants able farmers and brave fighters. These Indians also had many more elephants than any other of their countrymen, and what is more, elephants of surpassing size and courage." These reports stirred Alexander's desire to go further, but the Macedonians, who were Alexander's men, had by now grown quite weary of their king's plans, seeing him charging from labour to labour, danger to danger. One of the reasons why Alexander wanted to continue was because he wanted to go to the furthest eastern point of the earth to be the greatest that ever lived, and being better even than the mythical Greek stories of Heracles and Dionysus, and rule from the Pillar of Heracles in the west to the eastern side of India, where Dionysus apparently reached. So after back and forth conversations with his men, he eventually agreed, and they headed west again along the lower parts of that Eastern Asian area, as you can see on the lower portion of the map there. Along the way, there was another mutiny, which was mainly based around the fact that Alexander had been sort of subtly trying to replace his old Macedonian troops with Asian troops instead, so he could continue with his campaign into India. His original troops thought he was trying to get rid of them and replace them with Asians who would be more loyal and more willing to fight. Alexander wanted to settle this debate as quickly as possible, so he held a banquet, or a series of banquets, which was intended to harmonise the Macedonian and the Asian troops. However, it was this that marked the end of his campaign and also the end of his life. In 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32 after a long period of feasting and drinking. He was taken back to the original Alexandria in Egypt, where he was buried right there in his favourite city. At the point of his death, his empire, as you can see on the map, stretched latitudinally from Thrace, northwest of Turkey, to southern Egypt, and longitudinally from Greece to the Indus Valley in the Far East. This meant that his empire covered an area of which is what's estimated 5.2 million square kilometres, which it achieved in just 13 years. And to put that into perspective, the area taken up by Macedonia when he started was about 67,000 square kilometres. So if we extrapolate that out into how quickly he expanded his territory, that's just under 400,000 square kilometres overtaken every year, or just over 1,000 square kilometres per day that he overtook, which is a fair bit considering they took 7 months to overtake Tyre, and they were just in that section for 7 months. But anyway, looking into what happened after the campaigns of Alexander, he had 4 generals which governed his territory, and after he died, there was no natural successor. So 4 of these generals took control of differing parts of his territory. The fact that the kingdom was split shows that the generals were sort of shimmying for power. They were rivals. They're referred to in history as Diadochi, and after the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, the kingdom of Alexander was split up between 4 of his generals. They were Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, and Antigenes. So Ptolemy settled himself in the lower part of the territory, and he was welcomed in as the leader, as he was the one who was responsible for returning Alexander's body to Alexandria, where he was loved. So Seleucus took control of the Middle East and the eastern area. Antigenes took control of the Phrygian area and Thrace, and Cassander took control of the Grecian and the Macedonian portion of the territory. Essentially, Alexander's kingdom was split up. Ever since taking control of the kingdom of Macedonia, he'd worked hard over his 13 years of rulership to expand the territory he was given, and soon after that reign stopped, the kingdom was split up and divided between 4 generals. So that's a really, really basic, overarching look at the campaign of Alexander, and I haven't covered everything, I know that, but it sort of shows a few of the key things we want to focus on. As we said, he was a formidable power, and there wasn't much that got in his way that he wasn't able to overcome. Now, as we said, our lecture this evening is based on the Bible. So now that we've seen the history and what actually happened based on historically accurate events, it's important now to see how this relates to the Bible. So what we're going to see is that the Bible prophesied Alexander's entire campaign, but also that it's only a small part of the prophecies that are held within the Bible, and that God, as the author of the Bible, was using Alexander to achieve his purpose with the earth, which we'll look at later. So as our chairman said, our overarching theme for our lecture this evening, as well as last week's and a few to come, is influential people God used, which is mainly based on the fact that all of these people, all these key people, were part of key nations that God used to achieve his purpose, which is why we're looking into this, or why we're sharing this with you all. So if any of those titles interest you, feel free to come along, because we're definitely in for a fairly exciting series. However, back to Alexander. If we were to start by seeing where in the Bible Alexander the Great was mentioned with no previous knowledge of the Bible, we'd probably have a little bit of difficulty, because neither Alexander nor Alexander the Great is mentioned at all in the Bible. However, the fact that we have a reading that's taken from the Bible this evening in Daniel 8 might give you a bit of a hint that there are references to him, perhaps hidden, that we can help you with to show that Alexander is indeed referred to. Now, what I'm going to do here is read a section of our reading tonight, and if you could just follow along, knowing now what you know about Alexander and his campaign, and see if you can work out for yourself from what I'm reading whether it relates to Alexander or not. So I'm going to read, it's on the screen as well, Daniel 8, verse 5 to 8. So Daniel 8, verse 5 to 8. As I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. So I'm sure you noticed at least a few things there that related to the story we just went through. Firstly, in verse 5, the he-goat coming from the west was coming from Macedonia and the Grecian area, as we know from this map, because Alexander started in Macedonia and he moved from that area toward the Persian territory. I'm sure you also noticed from verse 5 that there was a notable horn between the eyes of the he-goat, which is probably one of, if not the most obvious reference to Alexander in the Bible. The he-goat was the Grecian army, or the Macedonian army itself, and Alexander as their leader and as their secret weapon full of all the military tactics, or the brain of the operation, was that notable horn. You probably also noticed that it mentioned in verse 5, the he-goat touched not the ground, referring to the speed at which it attacked and defeated. And just a way of portraying this, if you've ever seen a goat charging, you'll notice that its front feet don't actually touch the ground when it's attacking, meaning the back legs doing all the pushing, and it creates the effect that it's not touching the ground at all. It's moving with such speed. Hence, verse 5 says, the he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. It was coming so fast with such power that the ram couldn't do anything to stop it or slow it down. And as we know from the history of Alexander the Great, he completed his entire campaign in 13 years and used tactics that were so new and so unable to be combated that he conquered the entire Persian territory with what seemed to be apparent ease. You can see that also shown in verse 7 where it says, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he, Alexander, cast him the Persian kingdom and Darius down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Before Alexander, the Persian kingdom was obviously the strongest at the time, and therefore Alexander defeating the Persians meant that there was no one who could fight back, and also prophesied there in verse 7. Now we skip verse 6, so just jumping back to that. It refers to the ram that had two horns. I'm just going to spend a bit of time explaining this, but really simply we've been referring to the power that Alexander overthrew as the Persians, when really it was the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Medes and the Persians under the reign of King Darius III. If you keep your hand in Daniel 8, because we'll be back shortly, and turn to Daniel 5, verse 25 to 28, I just want to read a section, and then I'll explain it in a second, to show the prophecy about the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel 5, verse 25 to 28 says, "And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath outnumbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." So the context to this is just before the kingdom of Babylon was overthrown, and God was prophesying through Daniel that Babylon would be overthrown by the Medes and the Persians, or the two horns of the ram, as mentioned in Daniel 8, verse 6. God said through Daniel to the king of Babylon at the time, Nebuchadnezzar, essentially that his kingdom would be overthrown and divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And there's actually a very accurate depiction of this process from Babylon to the Medes and the Persians and then to the Grecian Empire in Daniel 2 in a prophecy referred to as Nebuchadnezzar's image. So we won't read through it all because we'll come back to it later at the end of the lecture, but it's described in detail in Daniel 2 verse 31 to 45 if you want to note it down. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar's image is a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had given by God to prophesy using Daniel, the prophet, the entire history of the key nations in charge of the region of the Middle East and the surrounding areas from Babylon all the way through until today, or actually in the future. So the image, as you can see on the screen, had a head of gold, it had a chest and arms of silver, had belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And each of those different metals represented a different nation, as you can see on the screen. Now the reason I'm bringing that up is because it prophesies, as we said, that the Medes and the Persians, or the two horns of the ram that Alexander the Great figuratively destroyed, would overthrow or supersede the Babylonian Empire, as we know it did from history. Then after that, they themselves, the Medo-Persians, would be overthrown by the he-goat with the notable horn later, or the Grecians, which we know from history, and it's also shown in Nebuchadnezzar's image. As you can see, the Roman Empire is next on the list, and as we know from history, the Roman Empire was the next to take over, showing the image is actually very historically accurate. Now turning back to Daniel 8 though, which you probably have your hand in still, and looking at verse 8, just to read it again. "Therefore the he-goat," that's Alexander and the Greek Empire, "waxed very great," as we know Alexander the Great. "And when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven." Like we saw from our story of the Grecian power, Alexander and the Greeks definitely did wax great, and they were very, very strong. They took over the whole world at the time, basically, in 13 years, which, as we saw from the land they covered, was a fair achievement. So it's safe to say they were a fairly strong force. Now going back to that map, we know that just after Alexander conquered and took control of the whole area, he died. So in verse 8, the great horn was broken. The great horn, Alexander, the one at the helm, the one leading them, was broken off, and the he-goat no longer had its power. So after the horn was broken off, in Daniel 8, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. So the four winds of heaven is basically just in reference to the fact that there is a scattering, as in Jeremiah 49 and Matthew 24, the four winds of heaven are described as originating from or travelling toward the four corners of the earth, or the ends of the earth. And as we know from history, as we saw, after Alexander died, his 4 generals took over his territory, and each of the 4 generals took their own sections. They took the north and the south and the east and the west. So just from those 4 verses there in Daniel 8, as well as Nebuchadnezzar's image, we can see already how tied up Alexander the Great actually is in Old Testament history. But that's not all. Daniel has more to say about Alexander in Daniel 11, verse 1 to 4. And in verse 1, he refers to Darius, who was no doubt Darius III, the ruler of Persia at the time. And he was referred to as one of the richest and most powerful individuals in the kingdom, specifically when compared to previous Persian kings. As you can see there in verse 2, the last king of Persia shall be far richer than they all. It also says, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And if you look we also know from history that one of his aims, or one of Darius' aims, was to expand his territory into the Grecian continent, which he failed to achieve many times. This was mostly due to the fact that, like verse 3 goes on to say, a mighty king shall stand up, which we know is Alexander, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And Alexander's aim, or his will, was to conquer Persia, and we know he achieved that. Verse 4, and when he shall stand up, Alexander, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. As we know, Alexander's kingdom wasn't divided to his posterity or his offspring, but like Daniel's prophecies say, it was divided toward the 4 winds of heaven and split between his 4 generals. So we can see this very clear message of Daniel's prophecy in the Old Testament showing Alexander's entire campaign in a fair bit of detail. Now obviously it doesn't show exactly where he went and when, but it gives enough key information for us to show that it's clearly referring to Alexander the Great, and it shows from Nebuchadnezzar's image that it's a part of an overall plan that God clearly has in place. He was simply using Alexander as one of his pawns to achieve the end goal, which again we'll look at toward the end of our lecture this evening. Now, one other prophecy which is a little more specific about a few individual campaigns and movements of Alexander is in Zechariah 9. Now, we won't read through the whole chapter, but essentially, Zechariah prophesied certain conquests of the Grecians while under the leadership of Alexander. They were prophesied about 2 centuries before they actually occurred, and at that time, no one could possibly have known that the Greeks would ever amount to a remotely powerful military force. The prophecy of Zechariah refers to the punishment that God would send on various areas, such as Hadrach and Damascus in verse 1, Phoenicia with its cities Tyre and Sidon in verse 2, and then other areas like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza in verse 5. As we know, Alexander entered Syria in 333 BC, and he defeated the Persian army at the Battle of Issus, like we said, and from then on Damascus was under Greek control. One section of the chapter of Zechariah 9 that's pretty clearly happened, that we spend a bit of time on, is the conquering of Tyre, which we spend a bit of time on. In verse 3 to 4 of Zechariah 9, it says, and Tyrus, or Tyre, did build herself a stronghold, and heaped up silver as the dust, and fine gold as the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will cast her out, and he will smite her power in the sea, and she shall be devoured with fire. Now we saw how Tyre definitely had built themselves up a bit of a stronghold by making a massive city offshore that no one could reach them. Nebuchadnezzar, we didn't mention this before, but Nebuchadnezzar had laid the city under siege for 13 years, but then Alexander came later and defeated them in 7 months. But as it says in Zechariah 9 verse 4, the Lord will cast her out, and he will smite her power in the sea, and she shall be devoured with fire, which is exactly what he achieved using Alexander as his pawn. Not Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander, because like we said, the series we're covering is how God used influential people for his purpose. So we know now that now that we've seen how Alexander was referred to in the Bible and where, I want to focus our attention on why God used him. Sure, we know that it was prophesied in Nebuchadnezzar's image that he would be the one to take over the Medo-Persian Empire and then be taken over by the Romans. But what was the end goal? What was God trying to achieve with all this? Well, we're told in Habakkuk 2 verse 14 and Isaiah 11 verse 9 in the Old Testament that the purpose of God is to fill the earth with his glory. That's his purpose. That's the end goal of what he's trying to do. So why then, ever since 605 BC through till today, has he been putting in place different nations and different kings with different ideals, all different and contrary to what God wants? Well, part of the reason, or more of an effect of this, is that it shows to us his incredible power of knowing, as we see in Isaiah 46, the end from the beginning. He knows what's going to happen long before it does, and as we know from the prophecies of Daniel and Zechariah that we looked at. They prophesied centuries before all this happened that it was going to happen, and through the guidance of God and through God using these people, it did. So it makes sense then that all the other prophecies in the Bible that foretell something to come are going to come to pass, and that's what we're going to have a look at now. So this means that, like I said before, we need to go back and have a look at Nebuchadnezzar's image. The image we looked at earlier showing the different nations in control of the Middle East area that would supersede each other. So we saw that the image is made up of different metals, and we can see that they all represent different nations. In Daniel 2, if we continue past what the physical image represents and look at what's prophesied after it, we'd be looking at verse 34 and 35, which says, "Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." That's a fairly easy description to understand visually, but also in Daniel 2, there's two parts to the description of the vision. There's Daniel's recount of what happened, and then there's his interpretation given by God of what it all means that he gives to Nebuchadnezzar. And the interpretation of this section can be found in verse 44 to 45, where it says, "And in the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure." So to start with, verse 44, basically the interpretation is saying, once this is all over, it's going to be God's turn to set up a kingdom. He's going to set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, like the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans all were. And it won't be left to other people, like we know Alexander's empire was. It was left to his 4 generals. God's kingdom would break in pieces and destroy all of these kingdoms, all these past kingdoms, and note that there is no end date. It shall stand forever. All these other nations had an expiry date. God's kingdom will not. It shall stand forever. And verse 45 was showing to King Nebuchadnezzar that just as truly as he had seen the dream and all the entire image broken up by the rock, so the kingdom of God is going to happen as God intended. And the rock that smashed the image to pieces represents Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, in Acts 1 verse 11, we know that Christ is going to return to the earth, and when he does, he is going to be the one to act as that rock from Nebuchadnezzar's dream and crush all the nations of the earth to make way for the kingdom of God that will, as Daniel 2 verse 35 says, fill the whole earth. And what do we know God's purpose is? And going back to that earlier slide, his purpose is to fill the earth with his glory. His glory is essentially his character. From Exodus 34 verse 6 to 7 in the Old Testament, we know that his character is merciful, it's gracious, it's long-suffering, it's abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, children's children, unto the third and to the fourth generation. This is part of his perfect character that he wants to fill the earth with. As we know, the rock that was the key component in destroying the nations of Nebuchadnezzar's image was represented as Jesus Christ. And to show you that he will be the one with the ability to fill the earth with God's glory, we look at John 10 verse 30, which says, "I and my Father are one." Now, people can and have interpreted this quote to support Trinitarian beliefs, but actually it's just referring to the fact that God and his Son, Jesus Christ, are one in purpose. So it's actually Christ's goal also to fill the earth with God's glory. Now, from the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar's image, we know that Christ, as the rock, is destined to fill the earth with the glory of God. And we know from Habakkuk 2 verse 14, as we saw, that that's the same of God. Ever since the beginning, it's been his purpose to fill the earth with his glory. All the previous nations of the world that we looked at and that are happening today have lacked or are lacking significantly in many ways. But the fact that this kingdom God is going to set up will be for the sole purpose of manifesting God's character and his ways will mean that it will be perfect. And that's what we have to look forward to. God's given all of us the opportunity to be a part of that new kingdom to come. Hang on. Matthew 6 verse 33 says, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." We saw how powerful and great the empire of Alexander the Great was. God's kingdom is going to be infinitely more powerful and infinitely more great than anything that's come before it, including Alexander the Great and his army. And he's given you and I the privilege of being a part of that. So let's make sure that we are seeking first, as Matthew 6 says, the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and constantly trying to manifest the characteristics of God in our lives, because if we succeed, we can be confident that through God's mercy and through God's grace, we will be given a place in that kingdom to come.